It began with a book, not a sacred text or a gilded manuscript, but an anonymous, untitled codex bound in cracked, dark leather. It rested in the most forgotten corner of the restricted section of Our Lady of the Pines Abbey, a place where dust was the only true congregant. The year was 2008, and the Vermont winter was a merciless siege, its frigid air seeping through the stone walls, making the silence of the library feel even colder, even more profound. For Brother Leo, a 22-year-old novice tasked with the tedious chore of cleaning this archive of silent words, the book was just another object in a long day of penance and duty, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others that had not been touched in decades. He was a young man who had come to the Abbey seeking purpose, a quiet harbor after a storm in his own life. The rhythmic, monotonous work of dusting ancient shelves and cataloging forgotten tomes was a form of meditation, a way to quiet the noise of the outside world. His faith was simple, unwavering, and built on the solid foundation of the institution that had given him sanctuary. Our Lady of the Pines was a shadow of its former glory, with dwindling numbers and mounting debts, but to Leo it was the entire world. He believed in its sanctity, in the goodness of the men who walked its halls, and in the absolute truth held within its sacred library. This belief was the bedrock of his new existence. As the late afternoon sun bled away behind the snow-laden pines, the cavernous library grew darker, the weak electric bulbs doing little to push back the encroaching shadows. To see the faded spine of the next volume, Leo brought his candle closer to the untitled codex. The small flame danced, its heat radiating in the frigid air. He held it just inches from the yellowed vellum page he had opened at random, the smell of old paper and melting wax filling his nostrils. It was an unconscious gesture, a simple act of necessity born from the failing light. An act that would irrevocably shatter the peace he had worked so hard to find and unearth a secret buried for 20 years. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a phantom of his tired mind. Faint brownish letters began to ghost into existence on the margin of the page, as if summoned by the candle's warmth. He pulled the flame back, and they vanished. His heart began to beat a little faster. He moved the candle forward again, cautiously this time. The words reappeared, clearer now, a spidery script emerging from the blankness of the vellum. It was not an illusion. It was sympathetic ink, a secret language waiting for a spark of heat to give it voice. He was reading a text that was never meant to be seen, a confession written between the lines of a forgotten book. The image shifts, the cold of 2008 dissolving into the warmer, more vibrant autumn of October 1988. The same library, but alive. 2 monks are huddled over the very same codex, not with a candle, but under the golden light of a desk lamp. Brother Samuel, the wise, elderly guardian of the library, his face a mask of profound dread. Beside him, his young protege, Brother Daniel, looks as if he has seen a ghost, his youthful idealism draining from his face with every word they read. Their terror is palpable, a silent scream in the hallowed quiet of the library. They are not discovering a secret. They are being consumed by one. Their expressions tell a story of a faith pushed to its breaking point. Brother Samuel's hand, usually steady, trembles as he traces a line in the heretical text they have uncovered within the codex. He whispers something to Daniel, whose eyes widen in disbelief and horror. This book, this silent object, has become a source of immense danger to them. It contains a truth so monstrous it threatens to unravel not just their own beliefs, but the very foundation of the Abbey itself. They are standing on the edge of a precipice, and the codex is the force threatening to push them over. Their fear is not of damnation, but of a truth far more terrestrial and far more deadly. Days later, the abbot of that time announced their departure. The official story was clean, simple, and tragic in its own mundane way. Brother Samuel and Brother Daniel had suffered a crisis of faith, abandoning their vows and leaving the abbey in the dead of night without a word. The case was closed internally, a quiet shame to be absorbed into the abbey's long history. The community prayed for their lost brothers, and then, as institutions are designed to do, it moved on. The memory of the 2 monks faded, becoming just another whispered story, another cautionary tale for young novices about the fragility of belief in a world full of temptation. Back in the frigid library of 2008, Brother Leo stands alone, the candle shaking in his hand, the ghostly words glowing on the page. The official story he had heard about the two departed monks now feels like a flimsy veil over a dark and cavernous truth. He is holding the reason for their disappearance. This was not a crisis of faith, it was a discovery. The codex feels impossibly heavy, its leather cover cool against his skin, yet it seems to burn with the heat of its secret. He is no longer just a humble novice. He is the custodian of a 20-year-old crime, the sole witness to a confession written in invisible ink. The silence of the library is no longer a comfort. It is a presence, thick with unspoken history and menace. Leo leans closer, his breath fogging in the cold air, and reads the first fully formed sentence that the candle's heat reveals. The words are a chilling whisper from the past, an admission that transforms the dusty archive into a crime scene, where the lamb faces the setting sun. Beneath the cold stone, the guardians of silence rest. It was not just a confession admitting to a sin, it was a map. And it was pointing to a tomb hidden within the very walls he had once considered a holy sanctuary. The candle sputtered and died, plunging the small alcove into near-total darkness. Brother Leo didn't drop it. His hand simply opened, a reflex of pure shock, and the brass holder clattered onto the cold stone floor. The sound was unnervingly loud in the profound silence, an echoing clang that seemed to travel down the long aisles of forgotten books and accuse him. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The air in his lungs felt frozen, trapped. The words he had seen, summoned by the flame, were now seared into his memory, glowing against the back of his eyelids, like a demonic brand. Beneath the cold stone, the guardians of silence rest. The phrase was a shard of ice in his gut, and the sanctity of the library, his refuge, evaporated into a chilling, predatory emptiness. He was alone with a dead man's secret. His mind, usually a calm sea of prayer and routine, became a violent storm. He frantically sought a logical escape from the horror. A prank? Perhaps a long-forgotten joke by a cynical monk from another era. But the careful, spidery script felt too deliberate, too solemn for a jest. The sympathetic ink, a method of concealment itself, spoke of immense gravity and fear. This was not a game. He felt the rough texture of the vellum page under his fingertips, a tangible link to the hand that wrote those words 20 years ago. The truth of it settled upon him not as a thought, but as a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, making it hard to stand. The Abbey's quiet history had just revealed a scream. The phrase itself was a masterpiece of macabre poetry. Guardians of Silence. It was a title that could have belonged to librarians, to holy men who protected sacred knowledge. But paired with the word rest and the image of a cold stone, the meaning twisted into something monstrous. This wasn't about monks sleeping peacefully in a crypt. This was about bodies. This was about a hidden grave. The realization crashed over him with the force of a physical wave, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. His sanctuary, Our Lady of the Pines, a place he believed was built on prayer and devotion, was also a sepulchre. The very stones he walked upon every day might be concealing a crime, a truth so terrible it had to be buried and forgotten. Instinct screamed at him to run, to leave the book on the shelf, flee the library, and erase the last 10 minutes from his life. But his body refused to obey. A chilling paralysis held him in place, his eyes fixed on the dark, unassuming shape of the codex. He felt a profound, terrifying shift in his reality. The world he knew, the one of simple faith and quiet duty, had been a facade. Behind it lay this, a 20-year-old murder, a secret confession waiting for a spark of light and heat. He was no longer Brother Leo, the humble novice. He was now the sole keeper of a truth that had cost 2 men their lives. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the codex was daring him to look down. The weight of this newfound knowledge was suffocating. Who had written this confession? Was it the killer, tormented by guilt, or a witness, too afraid to speak aloud? Every possibility was a new thread in a web of danger that was now closing in around him. To speak of this would be to accuse men he considered his brothers, to challenge the authority of the institution that had saved him. To remain silent, however, would be to become an accomplice after the fact, to let the dead remain unmourned and their killer unpunished. He was trapped between sacrilege and sin, his vow of obedience now in direct conflict with his conscience. The path forward was shrouded in darkness, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that any step he took could be his last. His thoughts immediately turned to the official story of Brother Samuel and Brother Daniel. A crisis of faith, a quiet departure in the night. It had always been presented as a sad but simple tale of human frailty. Now, that narrative felt like a flimsy, almost insulting lie. They hadn't abandoned their faith. They had been consumed by something they found within these walls. They were not lost souls wandering the world. They were the guardians of silence resting beneath a cold stone. Leo felt a surge of cold fury mixed with his fear, an anger on behalf of these two men he'd never met, whose memory had been so callously desecrated to preserve a dark secret. Their story was not over, and he was now its unwilling narrator. What could he possibly do? Go to Abbot Michael? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through him. The abbot was a pragmatic, imposing figure, a man who valued order and the reputation of the abbey above all else. Would he even believe such a fantastic story? Or would he see Leo as a threat, a destabilizing force to be managed, perhaps even silenced in turn? The confession itself was written in invisible ink. It was a secret meant to stay hidden. By revealing it, Leo would be violating its very nature. He could already imagine the abbot's cold, dismissive gaze, the quiet warnings to forget what he saw, to leave the past buried. He was a novice, a boy in their eyes, and his word would be nothing against the institution's history. He reached out a trembling hand and slowly, carefully, closed the codex. The soft thud of the leather cover meeting the vellum pages sounded like a coffin lid closing. He placed it back in its exact spot on the dusty shelf, his movements precise, desperate to leave no trace of his discovery. He tried to regulate his breathing, to calm the frantic beating of his heart. He had to appear normal. He had to walk out of this library as if nothing had changed, as if the world was the same as it was an hour ago. But the codex remained, a silent, malevolent presence in the darkness. It was no longer just a book. It was a tombstone, a map, and a verdict waiting to be read, and it seemed to watch him as he retreated. The walk back to his cell was the longest of his life. Every shadow seemed to stretch towards him. Every gust of wind whistling through the ancient stone corridors sounded like a whisper. He saw the faces of his fellow monks in the hallway, men he had prayed with and broken bread with just hours before, and he could not stop the terrible question from rising in his mind. Was one of them a killer? Or the son of a killer? The abbey's peaceful, communal life now seemed like a fragile illusion, a thin layer of ice over a dark, turbulent ocean of secrets. He felt utterly alone, isolated by a truth he could not share and could not bear to carry by himself. He was a ghost haunting his own life. Once inside the cold security of his small room, he collapsed onto his cot, the rough wool of the blanket, a poor comfort. He stared at the simple wooden cross on the wall, the symbol of his faith, the reason he had come to this place seeking peace. But peace was gone. The cross offered no answers, only more questions. How could a place dedicated to God harbor such a profound evil? The confession wasn't just about a murder, it was an attack on the very foundation of his belief. It suggested that the men he trusted as spiritual guardians were capable of the ultimate sin to protect a lie. The silence of his cell was no longer a comfort. It was a vacuum filled with the unspoken screams of the dead. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not over. The act of reading those words had been an initiation. He had crossed a threshold and could never go back. The anonymous confessor, by leaving that invisible message, had passed a torch through time, and Leo had just picked it up. Finding the message was only the first step. The chilling riddle, where the lamb faces the setting sun, was a directive. It was a map that needed to be followed, a crime that demanded to be solved. His life as a quiet novice was over. He was now an investigator, a seeker of a truth that the most powerful forces in his world would do anything to keep buried. But that was just the beginning of what was to come. What would you do in a situation like this? Do you think you could handle the weight of discovering that your safe haven is a crime scene? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're as hooked as we are. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single clue in this incredible story. Before the candle flame revealed a secret written in invisible ink, Our Lady of the Pines Abbey was, for Brother Leo, the very definition of sanctuary. Nestled deep in the green mountains of Vermont, the abbey was a relic of a more fervent age, its gray stone walls, a stark contrast to the vibrant, changing seasons. By the winter of 2008, it had become a place of profound, almost melancholic quiet. The number of monks had dwindled to a mere dozen, most of them old men, whose soft, shuffling footsteps were the loudest sounds in the long, cold corridors. The abbey was a living anachronism, struggling under the weight of mounting debts and a world that had largely forgotten it. Yet for Leo, this isolation was not a sign of decay, but a shield against the chaos he had left behind, a fortress of faith in a faithless world. Brother Leo himself was a young man seeking refuge from a past he rarely spoke of. At 22, he had arrived at the abbey's gates 2 years prior, not with the serene certainty of a lifelong calling, but with the desperation of a survivor. The secular world had offered him a life of noise, of fleeting connections, and a profound sense of purposelessness that culminated in a personal crisis. The abbey, with its rigid schedules, its vows of silence, and its unwavering focus on devotion, provided the structure his life had always lacked. He embraced the disciplined routine with the zeal of a convert, finding liberation in its constraints. His faith was not complex or theological. It was a simple, desperate gratitude for the peace he had found within these ancient walls. He believed in the goodness of the institution because he needed to. His days were a comforting rhythm of prayer, study, and manual labor, each task a meditation. He would wake before dawn for matins, the cold chapel air sharp in his lungs, his voice joining the low, resonant chants of his brothers. He worked in the gardens during the brief, glorious summers, and shoveled snow from the stone pathways during the long, brutal winters. His assignment to clean the restricted section of the library was seen not as a punishment, but as another sacred duty, a chance to be a custodian of history. The dust he wiped from the ancient tomes was, in his mind, the dust of ages, and his work was an act of reverence. He was content in his small, ordered world, blissfully unaware that he was polishing the surface of a deeply buried tomb. Presiding over this fragile ecosystem was Abbot Michael, a man whose presence was as solid and imposing as the abbey's stone foundations. In his early 60s, the abbot was a pragmatist, his faith tempered by the harsh realities of managing a dying institution. He was not a warm man, but he was respected for his sharp intellect and his unyielding dedication to preserving Our Lady of the Pines. To Leo and the other novices, he was a distant, almost monolithic figure of authority, his decisions absolute and his thoughts inscrutable. He carried the weight of the abbey's survival on his shoulders, and this burden had etched deep lines into his face. His sermons often spoke of protecting the sanctity of their legacy, a message Leo took as a spiritual directive, never imagining it could also be a warning. In stark contrast to the abbot's formidable presence was Brother Peter, the elderly assistant librarian. A frail, bird-like man with watery eyes and hands that trembled with age, Peter seemed to haunt the library more than he managed it. He was a man of few words, often communicating with a sad smile or a deep, world-weary sigh. He had been at the abbey for over 50 years and was one of the few who remembered Brother Samuel and Brother Daniel personally. A palpable aura of sorrow clung to him, a quiet guilt that Leo had always misinterpreted as simple piety or the melancholy of old age. Peter would watch Leo work, his gaze lingering on the younger man with a look of profound pity, as if he knew the boy's innocent peace was a temporary state, a fragile vessel about to be shattered. The story of the two departed monks, Brother Samuel and Brother Daniel, was a piece of the abbey's modern folklore, a cautionary tale told to novices. The official narrative, cemented over 20 years, was simple and tragic. In the autumn of 1988, the two men, one a wise elder and the other his promising protege, had suffered a sudden and severe crisis of faith. They had abandoned their vows, packed a small bag in the dead of night, and simply walked away from the abbey, leaving behind only a brief, vague note for the abbot of that time. The community had mourned their departure as a spiritual failure, a testament to the powerful temptations of the outside world. Their names were rarely mentioned, their memory a quiet shame that reinforced the importance of unwavering obedience and the dangers of intellectual pride. This carefully constructed history existed against a backdrop of quiet desperation. The abbey, once a thriving center of pilgrimage known for a sacred relic of its founder, now saw few visitors. The meager income from its small farm and winery was not enough to cover the costs of heating the cavernous stone buildings or repairing the crumbling roofs. Abbot Michael spent much of his time writing letters to the diocese and potential benefactors, his pleas for funding becoming increasingly urgent. This financial precarity created an undercurrent of tension within the community. The monks knew their way of life was fragile, and they clung to their traditions and their history as a source of strength. The abbey's reputation was its most valuable asset, a legacy of holiness that had to be protected at all costs. Thus, the climate before the discovery was one of serene, deliberate ignorance. It was a world sealed off from itself, where routine was a shield, and silence was a form of protection. For Brother Leo, life was a straight and narrow path, illuminated by the clear light of faith. He trusted his superiors, loved his brothers, and believed he was part of an unbroken chain of sacred tradition. The abbey was not just a collection of buildings. It was a living embodiment of truth and goodness. The peace was real, but it was the peace of a perfectly preserved room where the windows had been painted black, concealing the storm raging just outside. It was this perfect, fragile world that the heat from a single candle was about to set ablaze, exposing the rot that lay beneath the holy stones. The personal crisis that had driven Brother Leo to the abbey was not one of violent tragedy, but of a quiet, creeping emptiness. In his life before the cloth, he had been a promising literature student at a prestigious university, surrounded by the clamor of ambition and intellectual debate. Yet he found himself drowning in the noise. The endless theories, the deconstruction of every belief, the relentless pursuit of secular success, it all felt hollow, a grand performance of meaning without any substance. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, disconnected and adrift in a sea of irony. The abbey's promise was not one of answers, but of silence. He came seeking a place where the world's incessant chatter would finally cease, allowing him to hear something true, something real within himself. The rigid discipline was not a cage, but an anchor for a soul that had been lost at sea. Abbot Michael, in contrast, was a man firmly anchored to the terrestrial world. His faith was an intricate machine of logistics, fundraising, and institutional preservation. He had inherited the leadership of a sinking ship and saw it as his divine duty to keep it afloat, using whatever tools were necessary. More often than not, those tools were pragmatism and a will of iron. He was known to spend long nights in his study, not in contemplative prayer, but hunched over financial ledgers, the dim lamplight illuminating the stark reality of their deficits. He believed the abbey's legacy, its centuries of prayer and sanctuary, was a greater good that justified smaller, necessary compromises. To him, an inconvenient truth was a liability, a potential cancer that had to be contained to save the body. This belief was not born of malice, but of a desperate, protective love for the institution he served. The dynamic between the young, earnest Leo and the ancient, haunted brother Peter was one of unspoken gravity. Peter, the assistant librarian, moved through the towering shelves like a wraith, his presence a constant, sorrowful whisper. Before the discovery, he would often observe Leo from a distance, his watery eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and fear. On one occasion, as Leo was cataloging a particularly ancient set of manuscripts, Peter had shuffled over and, without looking at him directly, murmured, "Be careful, my son. Some histories are written on the soul, not the page. They are heavier than they appear." At the time, Leo had dismissed it as the poetic rambling of an old man. Only later would he understand it as a desperate veiled warning from a man who had been a silent witness to a history too terrible to speak aloud, a prisoner of a secret for 2 decades. The Abbey's isolation was both a spiritual asset and a practical fortress. Located at the end of a winding, poorly maintained road in the heart of Vermont's Green Mountains, it was geographically and culturally cut off from the modern world. During the long winters, which could last for more than 5 months, heavy snowfall often rendered the road impassable for weeks at a time, sealing the monks within their stone sanctuary. There was no internet, no television, and the single landline phone in the abbot's office was used sparingly. This profound seclusion nurtured a unique ecosystem where time seemed to move differently, and the outside world felt like a distant, almost mythical place. It was this very isolation that had allowed a secret as monumental as a double murder to be so completely and effectively buried, preserved in the cold, silent earth like a fossil. At the very heart of the Abbey's identity, housed within a special alcove in the main chapel, was its most sacred relic, a small, unassuming wooden shard said to be from the walking staff of their sainted founder. It rested on a cushion of faded crimson velvet, encased in a tarnished silver reliquary. For centuries, pilgrims had traveled to Our Lady of the Pines to pray before it, and their donations had built and sustained the Abbey. By 2008, the pilgrims had dwindled to a trickle, but the relic's symbolic power remained immense. It was the cornerstone of their history, the tangible proof of their divine legacy. The older monks, particularly Abbot Michael, treated it with a fierce, protective reverence that went beyond simple piety. For them, it was not just an object of faith, it was the very soul of the institution, the one thing that could not, under any circumstances, be allowed to be questioned. The daily routine was the Abbey's heartbeat, a steady, predictable rhythm that had remained unchanged for generations. The day was punctuated by the tolling of the chapel bell, calling the monks to prayer 7 times, from the pre-dawn chill of matins to the final, quiet contemplation of Compline. In between, there was a life of simple communal labor, tending the vegetable garden, brewing ale in the small brewery, and maintaining the ancient stone buildings. Meals were eaten in silence in the refectory, the only sound being the soft clinking of cutlery and the voice of one monk reading from a sacred text. This unwavering structure was designed to empty the mind of worldly distractions, and for Leo, it had been a profound source of peace. He embraced the monotony, finding a deep sense of purpose in the humble, repetitive tasks that formed the unshakable foundation of his new life. The nearby town of Pine Creek, a small, insular community of loggers and farmers, regarded the Abbey with a complex mixture of respect and suspicion. The monks were a curiosity, figures from another time who descended into town once a week in their old pickup truck for essential supplies. The townspeople kept a respectful distance, viewing the Abbey as a place of quiet mystery. The local Vermont State Police Barracks, a modern, functional building on the edge of town, had even less interaction with the secluded monastery. To them, the Abbey was a self-contained, self-policing entity. In 20 years, there had not been a single official call made from Our Lady of the Pines. This unspoken pact of non-interference created a perfect blind spot, allowing the Abbey to exist outside the normal purview of secular law. a sovereign territory where the only authority was the abbot, and the only law was canon. Before the Codex revealed its secret, the atmosphere within Our Lady of the Pines was one of serene, almost willful tranquility. It was a community built on a shared narrative of holiness and sacrifice, a story they told themselves and the world. Brother Leo, in his youthful idealism, accepted this narrative as absolute truth. For him, the Abbey's history was an unblemished tapestry of faith. But for those like Abbot Michael and Brother Peter, who knew of the frayed threads and dark stains hidden on its reverse side, this tranquility was a fragile, carefully maintained performance. It was the quiet of a room where everyone tacitly agrees not to mention the body under the floorboards. This delicate peace, preserved for 2 decades through silence and denial, was entirely dependent on the past remaining buried. It was waiting for a single, accidental spark to ignite the truth and burn the entire illusion to the ground. For 3 days, the riddle became Brother Leo's secret penance, a tormenting loop of words that echoed in the silence between prayers. Where the Lamb faces the setting sun, beneath the cold stone, the guardians of silence rest. The phrase was a ghost that haunted his every waking moment and invaded his dreams. He would perform his duties, serving meals, cleaning the cloisters, chanting the psalms, with a mechanical precision that masked the storm raging within him. His fear was a physical entity, a cold knot in his stomach that tightened every time he saw Abbot Michael's imposing figure, or caught the sorrowful, knowing gaze of Brother Peter. The confession was no longer just words on a page. It was a living thing, a directive that demanded action, and the weight of that demand was slowly crushing his spirit, forcing a choice between the sanctity of his vows and the desperate cry of the dead. On the 4th night, huddled in his freezing cell long after the final bell for Compline had faded, Leo forced his mind away from panic and toward logic. He lit a small candle, the flame a tiny, defiant spark against the oppressive darkness, and spread out a hand-drawn map of the abbey grounds he had made during his novitiate. He broke the riddle down into its constituent parts, his finger tracing the lines on the parchment. The setting sun. That was simple geography. West. The Lamb. This had to be a Christian symbol. His mind raced through the abbey's iconography. It was not the Lamb of God from the main altar. That faced east, towards the dawn. He needed a lamb that looked west, a lamb that watched the sun die each day. He meticulously scanned his memory of every statue, every carving, every stained glass window within the abbey's walls. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, chilling clarity that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The old chapel of St. Agnes. It was a small, semi-ruined structure on the far western edge of the abbey's property, unused since a partial roof collapse in the early 1970s. It had been deemed structurally unsound and was strictly off-limits. St. Agnes, the Virgin Martyr, was almost always depicted with her symbolic lamb. He remembered seeing it once, from a distance, a forlorn stone building slowly being reclaimed by the Vermont wilderness. It stood on a rise, its main facade facing directly west, perfectly positioned to watch the setting sun. The pieces locked into place with a horrifying, undeniable certainty. He knew where he had to go. The riddle was no longer a puzzle, it was a destination. Waiting until the deepest point of the night, when the abbey was submerged in a profound and heavy slumber, Leo slipped out of his cell. He wore dark, simple work clothes beneath his habit, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs that felt loud enough to wake the dead. The Vermont winter air was a physical assault, a razor-sharp cold that stole his breath and burned his lungs. Every crunch of his boots on the frozen snow sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. The moon was a sliver, casting long, menacing shadows from the ancient pines that seemed to claw at him as he passed. He felt like a transgressor, a heretic stepping out of the sacred order of his life and into a forbidden wilderness. He was breaking his vow of enclosure, a sin he offered up as a desperate prayer for the 2 souls he now sought. The door to the old chapel groaned on rusted hinges, the sound a low moan of protest at being disturbed after decades of silence. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp stone, decay, and forgotten incense. Leo's flashlight beam cut a nervous path through the gloom, illuminating a scene of ghostly desolation. Pews were overturned, covered in a thick shroud of dust and debris. A tattered tapestry hung from one wall, its threads unraveling like ancient flesh. He moved towards the altar, his light catching the faded remains of frescoes on the ceiling, scenes from the saint's life. And there, carved into the front of the heavy stone altar, was the image he was looking for, a lamb, its gentle face turned resolutely toward the west, its stone eyes staring out at the place where the sun would set. He was standing at the very spot the confessor had described. The altar was a single, massive slab of granite, a cold and immovable monument. Beneath the cold stone, the codex had said. Leo set down his flashlight, its beam pointing at the base of the altar, and placed his hands on the rough, frigid edge of the slab. He pushed. Nothing. It felt as if he were trying to move a mountain. Desperation gave him a surge of adrenaline. He braced his feet against the broken flagstones, his muscles screaming in protest, and pushed with every ounce of his being. For a moment, there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing, and then a low, grating screech of stone against stone. It moved. Just an inch, but it was enough. He worked frantically, leveraging a fallen roof beam as a crude crowbar, the sound of his efforts echoing horribly in the dead silence of the chapel. With a final, agonizing heave, he managed to shift the altar stone enough to reveal a dark opening in the floor beneath it, a cavity. It wasn't a proper crypt, just a crudely dug hole, a dark, gaping mouth in the earth. His hands trembled so violently, he could barely hold the flashlight steady. He knelt, the cold of the floor seeping through his trousers, and aimed the beam into the darkness. The light fell upon a chaotic jumble of shapes and shadows. At first, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. Then the details sharpened into a vision of pure horror. He saw the unmistakable, curved shape of a human rib cage, the pale white of a femur, and then a skull, its empty eye sockets staring up into the flashlight's glare. The skeletal remains were entangled in the dark, rotting tatters of two monastic habits. He scrambled backward, a strangled gasp escaping his lips as he knocked over the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam spinning wildly, casting frantic, dancing shadows across the macabre scene in the pit. The truth was no longer a whisper from the past, a ghostly script on a page. It was here. It was real. It was a grave. The guardians of silence were not a metaphor. They were the two monks who had vanished 20 years ago, their bodies hidden in this unholy tomb, their memory erased by a lie. The sacred ground of the abbey was a crime scene. The air in the chapel felt thick and suffocating, poisoned by the presence of this profound evil. He was no longer a novice seeking peace. He was a witness to murder, and the silence of the abbey suddenly felt like the silence of a predator waiting to strike. Back in the suffocating confines of his cell, Brother Leo was no longer a man of God, but a haunted animal, trapped in a cage of his own making. The image of the skeletons was burned onto the back of his eyelids, a permanent, gruesome afterimage that flickered every time he blinked. He could still smell the cloying odor of damp earth and decay, a scent that seemed to cling to his habit, to his skin, to the very air he breathed. He scrubbed his hands raw in the small basin, but he couldn't wash away the feeling of the grave's coldness, or the sight of those two skulls, their empty sockets, a silent, eternal accusation. The peace he had sought within these walls had been a lie, a thin veneer of sanctity painted over a charnel house. Every prayer that now formed on his lips felt like a blasphemy, an empty sound in a place where God had apparently been absent for a very long time. He forced himself to breathe, to push the raw panic down and replace it with the cold, hard discipline he had learned in the abbey. He began to dissect the horror, transforming it from a nightmare into a list of facts. Fact 1. 2 sets of skeletal remains were interred in an unmarked grave. Fact 2. The bodies were dressed in the rotting remnants of monastic habits, confirming their identity as monks. Fact 3. The grave was deliberately concealed beneath the massive stone altar of a deconsecrated chapel, a location that required significant effort and knowledge of the grounds to access. Fact 4. The official story of Brother Samuel and Brother Daniel's departure was not just a lie, but a cover-up for a double homicide. These were not theories. They were certainties, as solid and as cold as the stone that had hidden them for 20 years. His fear began to crystallize into a grim, terrifying resolve. The immediate, instinctual thought of confessing everything to Abbot Michael died before it could fully form. It was replaced by a chilling suspicion that felt as certain as the evidence he had just uncovered. The abbot was the guardian of the abbey's legacy, a man who saw its reputation as a sacred trust to be protected at any cost. Leo could now perfectly envision the abbot's reaction. A cold, dismissive gaze, a stern warning about the dangers of an overactive imagination, and a quiet, unyielding order to forget what he had seen. The abbot wouldn't see a crime that needed solving. He would see a threat that needed containing. Leo understood with sickening clarity that his vow of obedience, the cornerstone of his monastic life, had now become a potential pact with evil. To obey would be to become an accomplice, to help shovel the earth back onto the bones of the dead. His only true ally in this waking nightmare was the silent codex. It was more than a confession. It was a testament, the last will of a soul trapped between guilt and self-preservation. He knew he had to go back to it, to coax more of its secrets from the vellum. The location of the bodies was only the first part of the message. The most critical question remained unanswered. Why? What could two monks possibly have discovered that was so dangerous, so heretical, that their own brothers would bludgeon them to death and bury them in unhallowed ground? The motive was the key, the one piece of information that could transform this from a simple, brutal murder into something far more profound and terrifying. He had to understand the nature of the secret they died to protect before he could decide how to expose it. The codex was his only guide through the darkness. The decision, when it came, felt like a schism in his soul. He would have to break his vows. He would have to reach outside the sacred walls of the abbey and into the secular world he had so desperately fled. The weekly supply run to the nearby town of Pine Creek, a mundane chore he usually dreaded, was now his only hope, a singular lifeline to an external authority. The plan began to form in his mind, a desperate and dangerous gambit. He would need to feign illness, create a diversion, anything to get a few minutes alone, unobserved. His target was the old payphone he had seen outside the town's general store, a relic of a bygone era that was now his gateway to justice. The thought of betraying the abbey's trust filled him with a profound sense of guilt, but the image of the skeletons in their shallow grave was a far greater condemnation. That night, locked in his cell, he risked lighting another candle. His hands, though still trembling, moved with a new, deliberate purpose. He carefully heated a different section of the codex, a page filled with dense theological commentary. Slowly, like a ghost rising from a fog, new words in the familiar spidery script began to emerge in the margin. It was not a long sentence, just a cryptic, chilling fragment that sent a fresh wave of ice through his veins. The shepherd's staff was wood, not bone. The foundation is a lie. The words meant nothing and everything all at once. The shepherd's staff? It could only refer to the abbey's most sacred relic, the supposed walking staff of their sainted founder. The implication was staggering, a heresy of such magnitude that it could unravel the abbey's entire history. He now held the motive. The monks hadn't been killed over a simple disagreement. They were silenced to protect a holy fraud. The morning of the supply run, the winter sky was the color of slate, heavy and oppressive. Leo claimed a migraine, a plausible ailment in the drafty, cold monastery, and was reluctantly allowed to join the trip, tasked with picking up a prescription from the town pharmacy. During the silent, tense drive in the old pickup truck, he rehearsed his story, his heart hammering against his ribs. In Pine Creek, as Brother Thomas loaded sacks of flour, Leo slipped away towards the pharmacy. He bypassed it, his steps quickening as he approached the weathered phone booth. It felt like stepping into a confessional. He pulled the heavy door shut, sealing himself inside the small glass box. The cold plastic of the receiver felt alien in his hand as he fed the coins into the slot, the metallic clinks sounding like the tolling of a bell, signaling the end of his old life. His voice was a ragged whisper, unrecognizable even to himself, as he spoke to the Vermont State Police dispatcher. He gave no name, no context, just the cold, hard facts. "There are bodies at Our Lady of the Pines Abbey," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "in the old, abandoned chapel of St. Agnes, on the west side of the property." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "You'll have to move the altar. They're buried underneath." He hung up before the dispatcher could ask a single question, the sharp click of the receiver severing the connection. Leaning his forehead against the cold glass of the booth, he stared out at the quiet main street, a man caught between two worlds. He had done it. He had broken his silence. He had invited the law into God's house, and he knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The arrival of the Vermont State Police was a silent invasion, an intrusion of the secular world into a space that had considered itself sovereign for centuries. Two unmarked sedans crunched up the long, snow-dusted driveway, their modern, functional forms a stark contrast to the ancient, Gothic stonework of the Abbey. Detective Frank Miller stepped out of the lead car, a man on the verge of retirement whose weary eyes had seen too much to be impressed by sacred walls or vows of silence. He saw not a sanctuary, but a potential crime scene, isolated and self-contained, the perfect place to bury a secret. From a high window in the scriptorium, Brother Leo watched them arrive, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was no longer just a witness. He was an informant, a traitor to his own kind, and the sight of Miller's determined face was both a source of profound relief and a harbinger of the chaos he had just unleashed upon his home. Armed with a hastily issued warrant, Miller's forensic team entered the abandoned chapel of St. Agnes like a secular priesthood, their white coveralls replacing vestments, their tools of science replacing sacred relics. The air was thick with tension as they set up portable floodlights, banishing the chapel's holy gloom with a harsh, interrogating glare. Abbot Michael stood just outside the doorway, his face an unreadable mask of stone, flanked by the other monks who watched in horrified, prayerful silence. The grating screech of the heavy altar being moved was a sound of profound sacrilege, a violation of holy ground. As the team began the grim, meticulous work of exhuming the skeletal remains from their shallow grave, the line between sanctuary and crime scene was irrevocably erased. The Abbey's buried sin was now being unearthed under the cold, impartial gaze of the law, a truth exhumed for all the world to see. Detective Miller's first interview with Abbot Michael was not an interrogation but a carefully orchestrated duel of ideologies. They sat in the abbot's Spartan office, a crucifix on the wall the only witness to their conversation. Miller, direct and unadorned, laid out the facts. 2 sets of human remains, found on Abbey grounds, consistent with the 2 monks who vanished in 1988. Abbot Michael, his voice a calm, resonant baritone, did not deny the possibility, but framed it within a different narrative. He spoke of the Abbey's long history, of its internal methods of handling crises, of the sanctity of confession, and of the profound difference between secular law and God's law. He never lied, but he obfuscated, building a wall of ecclesiastical authority and tradition around the truth. Miller left the office with the distinct impression that he was not just investigating a murder, but challenging a kingdom with its own unwritten laws and its own fiercely protective king. The preliminary forensic report landed on Miller's desk 2 days later, its cold, scientific language cutting through the Abbey's mystical fog like a scalpel. The findings were stark and undeniable. The skeletal remains belonged to 2 Caucasian males, with ages at the time of death estimated to be 28 and 65. A perfect match for Brother Daniel and Brother Samuel. The cause of death was identical for both: massive, repeated blunt force trauma to the cranium, inflicted with a heavy, flat object. There were defensive wounds on the ulna of the younger victim. This was not a tragic accident or a quiet departure. This was a brutal, violent, and intimate act of murder. The report transformed the case, stripping away any lingering ambiguity. Miller was no longer looking for a lost story. He was hunting a killer who had, for 20 years, hidden a savage crime behind a facade of piety and prayer. While Miller was piecing together the physical evidence, Leo was locked in a desperate search for the motive, the spiritual poison that had led to such a crime. He risked returning to the silent codex, his hands trembling as he heated another margin of the vellum. New words ghosted into existence, more revealing than any before. They found the proof in the Gnostic texts. The staff of the founder is a lie, a bone passed off as wood. Our foundation is built on a dead man's femur, not a saint's faith. The revelation was a cataclysm, the abbey's most sacred relic, the source of its pilgrimage, its history, its very identity, was a fraud. Samuel and Daniel hadn't just stumbled upon a theological disagreement. They had discovered a conspiracy at the very heart of their faith, a lie so profound that it rendered their entire world a sacrilege. They were murdered not to silence a heresy, but to protect one. Clutching the terrible knowledge of the fraudulent relic, Leo felt an urgent need for confirmation, for a sign that he was not losing his mind. He found Brother Peter arranging prayer books in the main chapel, his frail hands shaking with an ever-present tremor. Leo approached him carefully, not mentioning the codex, but asking a seemingly innocent question about the abbey's founder and the famous staff. Peter's face, already pale, turned ashen. He dropped a heavy psalter, the book hitting the stone floor with a loud, accusatory thud. Without looking at Leo, he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Some pillars, my son, are so old that they are held up only by the darkness around them. If you shine a light on their foundations, the entire cathedral will collapse upon us all." It was not a confession, but it was a plea. He was begging Leo to stop, to leave the darkness undisturbed, confirming the truth with his terror. Miller's investigation, meanwhile, had taken a historical turn. With a second warrant, he gained access to the Abbey's archives, a treasure trove of records meticulously maintained for centuries. His team took high-resolution photographs of the invisible ink confession and began a painstaking comparative analysis of the script. The results came back a week later, conclusive and chilling. The delicate, spidery handwriting was a perfect match for that of Abbot Thomas, the man who had presided over Our Lady of the Pines in 1988. The man who had announced the departure of the two monks. The man who had died peacefully of a heart attack in 1998. The killer had confessed, but he was a ghost, long beyond the reach of earthly justice. The Codex was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a time bomb, a dead man's legacy of guilt intended to be found, but only when it was too late to punish the guilty party. The moment the name of a deceased abbot was officially linked to a double homicide, the case exploded beyond the quiet confines of Pine Creek. The regional diocese moved with the speed and efficiency of a powerful corporation facing a public relations disaster. A polished, formidable Monsignor named Wallace arrived, flanked by two sharp-suited lawyers from a Boston firm. They didn't meet with Miller at the barracks. They summoned him to a neutral location, a clear power play. They spoke not of justice, but of containment. They raised the statute of limitations, questioned the chain of custody of the Codex, and spoke of the immeasurable spiritual harm a public scandal would cause. The message to Miller's superiors was unambiguous: bury this, or face a war with an institution that had weathered empires and had infinite resources to protect its secrets. The investigation was no longer about two bodies. It was about the power of the church versus the state. Feeling the walls closing in, with his captain now advising caution, Miller knew the official channels were being choked off. He was being warned to drop the case. But Miller was a man who hated bullies, especially those who hid behind a crucifix. He made a decision that put his career and pension on the line. Through a trusted local deputy, he arranged a clandestine meeting with the anonymous caller. In the dead of night, in a deserted parking lot miles from the abbey, he finally came face to face with Brother Leo. The young novice, his face pale with fear but his eyes burning with resolve, told Miller everything. He spoke of the codex, the fraudulent relic, and the motive. In that moment, the two parallel investigations merged into one. A secret, dangerous alliance was forged between the cynical, world-weary detective and the devout, disillusioned monk, two men from different worlds united against a common, powerful enemy. Abbot Michael was no fool. He felt the shift in the investigation's intensity and knew its source could only be the young novice who had stumbled upon the chapel. He saw the fire in Leo's eyes and understood it could not be extinguished with simple warnings. His strategy changed from denial to containment. He summoned Leo to his office, his demeanor no longer stern but sorrowful, like a father disciplining a beloved but wayward son. He spoke of the burden of knowledge and the terrible wisdom of protecting the flock from truths they could not bear. He reminded Leo of his sacred vow of obedience, twisting it into a spiritual gag order. Then, under the guise of concern for Leo's troubled soul, he confined him to his cell for an indefinite period of prayer and fasting, cutting him off from the library, from Brother Peter, and from any possibility of contacting the outside world. The sanctuary had officially become a prison. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and the stakes had escalated to an almost impossible height. Detective Miller, acting against the unofficial orders of his superiors, was now pursuing a politically explosive case with a single, secret witness he could no longer contact. Brother Leo was a captive, isolated with a truth so monumental it could dismantle a centuries-old institution, but powerless to share it. The conflict had transcended a simple murder investigation. It had become a war over the very nature of truth itself, whether it was an absolute to be pursued at all costs or a dangerous force to be managed and controlled by those in power. Abbot Michael was no longer just protecting a historical crime. He was fighting to preserve a world built on a sacred lie. And with Leo silenced, it seemed as if the guardians of that lie were poised to win once again. Detective Miller felt the system closing in on him like a fist. His captain, a man he'd respected for 30 years, had called him into his office and spoken in the clipped, uncomfortable tones of someone delivering a message he didn't write. The words jurisdictional sensitivity and diocesan cooperation were used, but the meaning was clear: stand down. The official investigation into the murders at Our Lady of the Pines was to be quietly deprioritized, buried under a mountain of paperwork until it suffocated. Miller wasn't just being asked to drop a case. He was being ordered to become an accomplice to the same silence that had protected the killers for 2 decades. He walked out of the station feeling the profound, chilling isolation of a man whose own side had just abandoned him on the battlefield. The Abbey's influence, he now realized, extended far beyond its stone walls, its tendrils of power reaching deep into the secular world he had sworn to protect. Officially, Detective Frank Miller was on vacation, a long overdue break before his retirement. Unofficially, he was a ghost, working a case that no longer existed. He traded his badge for a library card and his squad car for his own beat-up pickup truck. He knew he couldn't breach the Abbey's walls again, so he began to attack its foundations from the outside. His first target was its finances. Murder, in his experience, was rarely just about faith. It was almost always about power, and power needed money. He spent days in the county archives, poring over 2 decades of public records, tax filings, and property deeds connected to the Abbey. He was searching for a tremor in the financial records around the autumn of 1988, a sudden influx or a desperate transaction that could provide a secular motive for a sacred crime, a tangible reason for such a brutal and definitive act of silencing. Inside the Abbey, Brother Leo's confinement was a slow, methodical assault on his spirit. Abbot Michael's visits were the most potent weapon. The abbot never raised his voice. Instead, he spoke with a sorrowful, paternalistic calm that was more unnerving than any threat. He framed the cover-up not as a sin, but as a painful, necessary sacrifice. He spoke of the thousands of souls who had found solace through the Abbey's sacred relic, arguing that their faith was a greater good than the cold, destructive truth Leo sought to unleash. He twisted Leo's own vows back on him, portraying his quest for justice as an act of spiritual pride, a selfish desire to shatter the peace of the flock for his own moral satisfaction. Leo felt his resolve being eroded, not by fear, but by the insidious, compelling logic of a man who truly believed that a lie could be holy. Trapped within the four cold walls of his cell, Leo turned his mind into its own restricted library. He fought back against the abbot's psychological warfare with the only tool he had left, his memory. He replayed the ghostly words from the Codex over and over, focusing on the fragment that held the key to the motive. They found the proof in the Gnostic texts. The Gnostics. He knew they were early Christian sects deemed heretical for their belief in secret knowledge. From his years of study, he began to mentally compile a list of the Abbey's known holdings, cross-referencing them with apocryphal and Gnostic Gospels that might have been hidden within the main collection. He was no longer looking for a confession. He was searching for the original sin, the forbidden knowledge that Brother Samuel and Brother Daniel had unearthed, the intellectual bomb that had cost them their lives and had been buried for 20 long years. Miller's painstaking work in the county archives yielded its first explosive result. In November 1988, just 1 month after the official date of the monk's disappearance, Our Lady of the Pines Abbey received an anonymous donation of $500,000. It was a colossal sum, equivalent to millions in today's currency, and it arrived at the precise moment the Abbey was facing bankruptcy and foreclosure. The money hadn't saved a holy institution, it had purchased its silence. Miller traced the wire transfer through a dizzying maze of shell corporations and trust funds, a financial labyrinth clearly designed to obscure its origin. The trail finally ended at a prestigious wealth management firm in Boston, the very same city from which the diocese had dispatched its high-powered lawyers. The conspiracy was no longer just a theory, it now had a balance sheet. This wasn't just a cover-up, it was a transaction. The anonymous donation was traced to one of Boston's oldest and most powerful families, the Bradfords, a dynasty whose wealth was matched only by their devout, public Catholicism and their centuries-long patronage of the Church. Detective Miller discovered that the family patriarch in 1988, a formidable industrialist named Alistair Bradford, had been a close personal friend and a major benefactor of the now-deceased Abbot Thomas. Suddenly, the scope of the crime broadened dramatically. This was not an isolated act of violence committed by a desperate cleric. It was a conspiracy that potentially involved a network of powerful secular figures, operating in concert with the highest levels of the regional diocese, all dedicated to protecting a shared, profitable secret. The two bodies buried under the altar were no longer just victims of the Abbey. They were casualties of a corrupt alliance between God and Mammon. Leo, meanwhile, had a flash of insight that cut through the despair of his confinement. He remembered an afternoon years ago in the library, listening to Brother Peter's seemingly senile ramblings. The old man had spoken of a rare Coptic manuscript in their collection, mentioning it by its Gnostic title, the Gospel of Truth, before trailing off in a fit of coughing. At the time, Leo had dismissed it as a confused memory. Now he understood it as a clue, a breadcrumb left for him years before he even knew he was on a trail. He realized that Brother Peter was not just a man tormented by guilt. He was a silent accomplice, a keeper of secrets who was too terrified to speak directly but too conscience-stricken to remain completely silent. He had to find a way to reach the old librarian, to let him know that the time for riddles was over. His opportunity came in the form of Brother James, a young, kind-hearted novice, assigned to bring him his daily meals of bread and water. James looked upon Leo with a mixture of pity and confusion, unable to comprehend the nature of his transgression. Leo used this innocence to his advantage. On a tiny scrap of parchment torn from his breviary, he scribbled a seemingly esoteric question about a specific Coptic translation technique, a query that would appear to any scholar as a simple academic curiosity. He folded the note and pressed it into the young novice's hand, asking him to deliver it to Brother Peter in the library, pleading that it was a matter of spiritual torment. He prayed the old librarian would see past the theological question and understand the desperate, coded message hidden within. "I know. Help me." Acting on a gut instinct that was now screaming at him, Miller drove the 4 hours to Boston. He found the Bradford family matriarch, Alistair's widow, living in a stately mansion that looked more like a museum. Eleanor Bradford was in her late 80s, her mind as sharp and unforgiving as cut glass. She was polite, but guarded, speaking of her late husband's profound friendship with the sainted Abbot Thomas. Miller played his hand carefully, steering the conversation to the Abbey's history and its famous relic. When he mentioned the founder's staff, a barely perceptible shadow passed over her features, a micro-expression of recognition that lasted less than a second but told him everything. He saw it. She knew the relic was a fraud, the conspiracy was real, and its roots ran deeper and were far older than even he had imagined. The lie wasn't just protected by the Abbey, it was owned by its benefactors. The note from Leo landed in Brother Peter's trembling hand like a burning coal. He read the obscure theological question and understood its true meaning instantly. It was not a query, it was an accusation. It was a signal that the young novice had found the source of the heresy, the Gnostic text that had started it all. The old librarian felt the weight of 2 decades of silent complicity crash down upon him. That night, he did not sleep. He knelt on the cold stone floor of his cell, his prayers a frantic, whispered debate between self-preservation and a final, desperate chance at redemption. Just before the bell for matins, having made his choice, he pried loose a floorboard beneath his cot. From the dusty space below, he retrieved a small, unassuming leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the neat, hopeful handwriting of a young man who had died 20 years ago, the personal diary of Brother Daniel. The conflict had now escalated into a silent, 2-front war. On the outside, Detective Miller, armed with the knowledge of a financial conspiracy and the complicity of a powerful family, was preparing to defy his own department and wage a battle against an institution that considered itself above the law. On the inside, Brother Leo, though physically imprisoned, had successfully activated his one potential ally, unleashing a ghost from the past in the form of a hidden diary. Abbot Michael, confident in his control, remained oblivious to the fact that the foundations of his carefully maintained silence were crumbling. He believed he had contained the threat, but the truth was now a pincer movement, closing in on him with the unstoppable force of a dead man's testimony and a secular detective's unyielding resolve. The final, devastating secret of the silent codex was about to be revealed. The summons came not as an order, but as a quiet, final invitation. Brother James arrived at Leo's cell, his face pale, and simply said, "The abbot wishes to see you in his study." The walk through the hallowed, silent corridors was a march toward an execution or an absolution. Leo did not know which. Every flickering candle seemed to cast his shadow long and distorted against the cold stone walls, a grotesque caricature of the monk he once was. He clutched the small, leather-bound journal hidden within the folds of his habit, its worn edges a tangible link to a dead man's courage. The wood of the abbot's door felt impossibly heavy under his knuckles as he knocked, the sound echoing the finality of a gavel. The air was thick with unspoken history, and he knew that whatever happened in this room would be the end of the world he knew. Abbot Michael's study was a cage of shadows and secrets, the air smelling of old paper, beeswax, and the faint acidic tang of cheap wine. A low fire crackled in the hearth, its hungry flames the only source of light, making the abbot's face a shifting mask of warmth and deep, impenetrable darkness. He sat behind a massive oak desk, a silent king upon his throne, his hands steepled before him. His expression was not one of anger, but of a profound, weary disappointment, the look of a father whose son has irrevocably broken his heart. "Brother Leo," he began, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the room, "I had hoped your time in prayer would bring you clarity. I had hoped you would understand the virtue of silence, the wisdom in letting the past remain undisturbed. I see I was mistaken." Leo did not respond with words. His hand, surprisingly steady, emerged from his habit. He placed Brother Daniel's diary on the polished surface of the desk, pushing it gently across the wood until it came to rest directly in front of the abbot. The small book, with its faded gold lettering spelling out the name of a man murdered 20 years ago, seemed to absorb all the light in the room. It was not a codex of ancient secrets. It was a simple personal journal, a testament to a life cut short. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any vow. The only sound was the frantic crackling of the fire and the slow, heavy ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each second a hammer blow marking the final moments before the collapse. In that small, unassuming object lay the power to demolish an entire world. The abbot's composure, so carefully constructed, so impenetrably solid, shattered like flawed glass. He did not gasp or cry out. Instead, a low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a noise of pure, animalistic agony. His eyes, fixed on the diary, widened with a horror that was ancient and absolute. He seemed to shrink in his chair, the formidable authority draining from him, leaving behind only an old, broken man. His hand, which had been so steady, trembled as he reached for the book, his fingers hovering over the leather as if it were a venomous snake. He knew what it was. He knew what it contained. The sight of it was a ghost from his own past, a resurrected sin he had believed to be buried forever, now lying on his desk like a final, unanswerable judgment. The battle was over before it had even begun. "Abbot Thomas," Michael whispered, the name a ragged, painful exhalation. He finally looked up at Leo, his eyes no longer holding authority but a hollow, haunted emptiness. "It was Abbot Thomas who did it, not me. I was his protege, just as Daniel was Samuel's. I was young, ambitious, and blind with devotion. He confessed it all to me, years later, when the cancer was eating him alive. He passed the burden to me, just as he passed the abbot's ring. His confession began not as a defense, but as a story, a dark inheritance he had carried in silence for over a decade. He spoke of his predecessor not as a monster, but as a desperate man, a guardian who had committed the ultimate sin to protect what he saw as a sacred, necessary lie. The truth began to unspool in the firelight, a tapestry of deceit woven a generation ago. He described the night of the murders with a chilling, second-hand clarity, recounting the story Abbot Thomas had burned into his memory. He spoke of how Brother Samuel, a brilliant historian, and the fiercely intelligent Brother Daniel had been studying a rare Gnostic text from the Coptic tradition. They found an annotation, a reference to an obscure local history that led them to the Abbey's founding documents, sealed in the archives. There, they discovered the original sin. The Abbey's most sacred relic, the staff of the founder, the very cornerstone of their faith, and the source of centuries of pilgrimage and wealth, was a fraud. It was a lie so profound, so foundational, that its exposure would not just discredit the Abbey, it would annihilate its entire history, rendering centuries of prayer and devotion a monument to a cheap deception. The staff was not a holy piece of wood. It was a human femur, an ordinary, anonymous bone, likely belonging to a long-forgotten medieval peasant that the Abbey's opportunistic founder had passed off as a sacred object to secure land grants and the patronage of a wealthy, credulous lord. The lie had been preserved for centuries, a secret passed down from abbot to abbot, a cynical truth hidden beneath layers of manufactured sanctity. Samuel and Daniel, armed with irrefutable textual and historical evidence, had uncovered this primal fraud. They saw it not as a secret to be protected, but as a cancer to be excised. Their faith was pure, absolute, and demanded the truth, no matter how devastating the consequences. They believed the institution could only be saved by cleansing it with a painful, public confession of its original sin. Abbot Thomas, a man who had dedicated his entire life to preserving the institution, saw their idealism as a death threat. Michael recounted Thomas's desperate pleas, his arguments that the lie had produced a greater good, the faith of thousands, the sanctuary of the abbey, the centuries of charity. He begged them to see the wisdom in silence, to protect the flock from a truth that would only shatter their belief and lead their souls to ruin. But Samuel and Daniel were intractable. Their conscience, their very faith, would not allow them to be complicit. They gave the abbot an ultimatum: reveal the fraud to the diocese and the community, or they would. They sealed their own fates with their integrity, their refusal to bow to a lie, no matter how holy its disguise. They chose truth over order, and in the world of Abbot Thomas, that was a fatal mistake. The description of the violence was stark and brutal, delivered in Michael's hushed, monotonous tone. The confrontation took place in the library, the very heart of knowledge. Thomas, in a fit of panicked rage, grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from a reading table. He struck Samuel first, from behind. Daniel, younger and stronger, fought back, his arms raised to defend himself, but the abbot was a man possessed by a desperate, terrifying strength. He bludgeoned them both to death amidst the towering shelves of sacred books, their blood staining the ancient vellum and the cold stone floor. The act was savage, intimate, and absolute. He had not just killed two men, he had murdered a threat to his entire world, silencing the truth with the most primitive and final of arguments. The library, a sanctuary of words, had become an abattoir. The cover-up, Michael explained, was a masterpiece of institutional power. Abbot Thomas, his hands still stained with the blood of his brothers, made a single phone call. He called Alistair Bradford, the family patriarch in Boston, a man whose ancestors had been patrons of the abbey for generations, and who was a member of the secret circle that knew about the fraudulent relic. The problem was handled with cold, corporate efficiency. The Bradford family provided the anonymous $500,000 to solve the abbey's financial crisis, a silent payment for a silent crime. They used their influence with the diocese to ensure no questions were asked. Thomas, with the help of a terrified brother Peter, cleaned the library, carried the bodies to the abandoned chapel in the dead of night, and buried them beneath the altar, sealing the tomb and the secret with a single massive stone. As Leo listened, the very foundations of his reality dissolved. The stone walls of the study seemed to ripple and warp, the firelight sickeningly bright. A wave of nausea washed over him, and the air grew thick and unbreathable. He saw the faces of his brothers, the kind, the old, the devout, and now saw them as potential accomplices in a grand, sacred lie. His faith, which had been his anchor, his refuge, was now revealed to be a house built on a dead man's bone and cemented with the blood of martyrs. The entire structure of his life, his purpose, his belief in the goodness of this place, crumbled into dust. He was no longer a monk in a holy sanctuary. He was a prisoner in a beautifully decorated mausoleum, and the man before him was not his spiritual father, but the warden of a generations-old crime. Abbot Michael finished his story, his voice devoid of emotion, his face a mask of weary resignation. Abbot Thomas saved this abbey, he said, his gaze locking with Leo's, a chilling certainty in his eyes. He made a terrible choice, a mortal sin, for which he is surely answering to God. But he protected the faith of thousands. He preserved this house of prayer. I have spent every day of my life as abbot honoring his sacrifice, by maintaining the silence, by carrying the weight of his sin so that others could live in peace. The truth you hold in your hands, Brother Leo, is a fire that will not cleanse. It will only burn. It will destroy everything, the good, the bad, the innocent, the guilty. It will turn this sanctuary into a ruin and the faith of good people into ash. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the silver of his pectoral cross. The full weight of his confession now settled upon Leo's shoulders, a burden far heavier than any vow. The codex, the diary, the bones, they are all yours now, the abbot said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. So is the choice. You can be the righteous storm that tears this house down to its rotten foundations, revealing a truth that will save no one and condemn us all. Or you can accept the terrible wisdom of your predecessors. You can understand that some truths are too dangerous for the light of day. You can burn the diary, forget the codex, and become the next guardian of the silence. The choice is yours, my son. Will you be a saint or a destroyer? For a long moment that stretched into an eternity, Brother Leo stood on the precipice of his own soul, the abbot's terrible choice echoing in the firelit study. He looked from the crackling flames that promised oblivion to the small, unassuming diary that held a dead man's truth, and then to the haunted face of Abbot Michael, a man trapped in a prison built by his predecessor. Leo felt the crushing weight of it all, the two skeletons in their unhallowed grave, the centuries of faith built upon a fraud, the quiet desperation of the men who called this abbey home. To burn the diary would be to murder the victims a second time. To unleash a public firestorm would be to incinerate the innocent along with the guilty. He realized with chilling clarity that both paths were forms of destruction. Neither was justice. True justice required not a storm or a silence, but a reckoning. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not the trembling whisper of a frightened novice, but the calm, measured tone of a man who had passed through an inferno and emerged with a terrible clarity. "No," he said, the single word cutting through the abbot's manipulative logic. "You are wrong. The choice is not between silence and destruction." He met Michael's gaze, his own eyes reflecting the firelight, burning with a conviction that startled the older man. The greatest sin here was not the lie itself, nor even the murders committed to protect it. The greatest sin was the belief that faith is so fragile it must be protected by evil. True faith, the kind that Samuel and Daniel died for, is not a child to be shielded from the dark. It is a light that must be strong enough to shine within it. I will not burn their story, and I will not become another guardian of your silence. With that, Leo outlined his third way, a path that was neither a surrender nor a crusade. He would not go to the press or the public. He would not seek to tear the abbey down stone by stone. Instead, he would take Brother Daniel's diary directly to Detective Frank Miller, allowing the secular world to judge the secular crime of murder and its concealment. The law would have its due, but the spiritual crime, the rot at the heart of the institution, required a spiritual penance. He demanded that Abbot Michael make a full and complete confession, not to the police, but to the regional bishop, laying bare the entire history of the fraudulent relic and the subsequent cover-up. It was a call for an internal cleansing, a painful surgery to save the soul of the institution, rather than an execution to satisfy public outrage. It was a demand for accountability, not annihilation. Staring at the resolute face of the young man before him, Abbot Michael saw not a rebellious novice, but the embodiment of a conscience the abbey had long since abandoned. The fight drained from his body, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. He had spent his life upholding a lie he inherited, and now he saw the moral bankruptcy of that choice reflected in Leo's unyielding eyes. With a slow, deliberate nod, he acquiesced. The next morning, as the abbot made his fateful call to the diocese, Leo walked out of the abbey's gates for the last time. In Detective Miller's stark, functional office, he placed the diary on the desk and recounted the entire sordid history. Miller listened without interruption, his cynical expression slowly softening into one of grudging respect. The gears of secular justice, once halted by influence and power, began to turn with unstoppable force, powered by a dead man's words and a young monk's courage. The legal resolution was swift and surgically precise. With Abbot Thomas, the murderer, deceased for a decade, there could be no prosecution for the homicides. However, armed with the diary, Brother Peter's corroborating testimony, and Abbot Michael's own confession, Detective Miller had more than enough to act on the cover-up. He formally charged Abbot Michael not with murder, but with 2 counts of accessory after the fact and 1 count of obstruction of justice. It was a pragmatic victory, a recognition that while the killer was beyond reach, the system that protected him was not. Abbot Michael accepted the charges without contest, his plea of guilty a final, public act of penance. He was sentenced to 5 years in a state penitentiary, a shocking and unprecedented outcome that sent tremors through the quiet world of Our Lady of the Pines. The Church, faced with an uncontainable legal scandal and the unwavering confession of one of its own abbots, moved to cauterize the wound. Monsignor Wallace returned, his demeanor no longer one of veiled threats but of grim crisis management. Abbot Michael was formally laicized, stripped of his titles and authority, his name effectively erased from the institution's history. The diocese conducted a quiet but thorough internal investigation, which resulted in the forced retirement of several senior clerics who had been complicit in the original silence of 1988. The power structure that had enabled the cover-up was dismantled not by public outcry, but by the quiet, irrefutable weight of the truth Leo had unearthed. The institution, in a desperate act of self-preservation, was forced to purge the very corruption it had been designed to protect for so long. Our Lady of the Pines Abbey survived, but as a profoundly changed place it did not fall into ruin. Under the leadership of a new, younger abbot, appointed by the reformist wing of the diocese, it began a long, painful process of atonement. The fraudulent relic, the femur that had been the source of both its prosperity and its damnation, was quietly removed from the chapel and handed over to historical archives as a medieval artifact of unknown origin. In its place, a simple, unadorned stone plaque was erected. It bore no grand pronouncements, only the names of 2 men, Brother Samuel and Brother Daniel, and beneath them the simple, devastating epitaph, in memory of those who sought the truth. The lie was finally dead, and the abbey began the slow, arduous task of building a new foundation, this time on a bedrock of painful honesty. For Brother Peter, the resolution was a quiet, painful release. He provided a full, tearful confession to Detective Miller, his words a torrent of guilt and regret held back for 20 years. The testimony of the frail old man, filled with details only a witness could know, sealed the historical record of the crime. He was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation. His final years were spent in the transformed abbey, a ghost of its past. He found his own form of penance in tending to the small memorial for Samuel and Daniel, his shaking hands polishing the stone plaque each day. He died peacefully a year later, his conscience finally, if not clean, then at least unburdened from the terrible weight of the silence he had been forced to keep, a final victim of Abbot Thomas's crime. The long shadow of the Bradford family's influence protected them from public prosecution, but not from consequence. Detective Miller's final report detailed their financial role in the cover-up, creating a political liability the diocese could not ignore. In a series of tense, private negotiations, the Church leveraged the threat of public exposure. The result was an enormous, anonymous endowment from the Bradford Family Foundation to a national fund for victims of clerical abuse. It was a quiet, unacknowledged settlement, a multi-million-dollar act of atonement paid to wash the stain of 2 murders from their dynastic legacy. Their name was never mentioned in a newspaper, their reputation remained intact, but they had been forced to pay for the silence they had purchased so many years ago, a final balancing of a deeply corrupt ledger. The 2 objects that had bookended the entire ordeal found their final resting places. The silent codex, its invisible confession now fully documented and photographed, was entered into the Vermont State Police Evidence Archives, its dark leather cover closing for the last time on a secret that had reshaped countless lives. Brother Daniel's diary, after being used to secure the conviction, was released by the state. Leo, through a lawyer, ensured it was delivered to Daniel's last living relative, a grandniece who had only known him as a faded photograph. Reading his words, she finally learned the story of the uncle she never met, not as a monk who lost his faith, but as a martyr who died for it. After 20 years, his voice was finally heard, and his sacrifice was finally known, bringing a quiet, bittersweet closure to his family's history. Leo never set foot inside a monastery again. The institution to which he had fled for sanctuary had been revealed as a tomb, and his faith in its structures was irrevocably broken. He formally petitioned to be released from his vows, a request that was quietly and quickly granted by a diocese eager to close this dark chapter. He left Vermont, shedding the identity of Brother Leo like a snake sheds its skin. He was simply Leo now, a man in his early 20s, adrift in the secular world he had once rejected. He carried not a cross, but the heavy wisdom that good and evil could wear the same holy robes, and that truth was a far more demanding and unforgiving God than the one he had once prayed to. He was alone, unmoored, but for the first time in his life, he was completely and utterly free. Months later, on the day before his official retirement, Frank Miller sat across from Leo in a quiet roadside diner. The old detective, his face softer without the weight of his badge, slid the thick, closed case file for Our Lady of the Pines across the Formica tabletop. He told Leo that in 30 years of police work, he'd learned that perfect justice was a myth, but what Leo had achieved, forcing a powerful, insulated system to hold itself accountable without destroying the lives of the innocent within it, was something far rarer and more difficult. It was a reckoning. It was the truth. They shook hands, two men from impossibly different worlds who had found a common ground in a shared, stubborn refusal to let a lie stand. It was a quiet, understated acknowledgment of the profound journey they had taken together. The resolution left a world forever altered. The central question, could faith survive the truth, was answered with a painful and complex affirmative. For Leo, the institution of faith had crumbled, but a more resilient, personal faith in conscience had been forged in the fire. For the Abbey, its survival depended on excising the lie it had cherished for centuries. The story's end was not a triumphant victory of good over evil, but a somber testament to the corrosive power of secrets and the immense courage required to break them. As Leo walked out of the diner and into the rest of his life, he was a living symbol of that truth, a man who had lost his religion but found his soul forever defined by the moment a single candle flame illuminated a confession written in invisible ink, and he chose to read it. The story of the Silent Codex did not truly end with a conviction or a confession. It ended in the quiet aftermath, in the lives irrevocably altered by the heat of a single candle flame. For Leo, walking away from the diner and the life he had once cherished, freedom was not a feeling of lightness, but a profound and heavy burden. He had shed his monastic habit, but he could never shed the knowledge of what lay beneath the sacred stones of the world. He was no longer a man of God, but he had become something more fundamental, a man of conscience. His faith had been shattered, but in its place, a harder, more resilient understanding of truth had been forged. He had sought peace in the Abbey's silence, only to find his true purpose in the act of breaking it, a paradox that would define the rest of his days. The tale of Our Lady of the Pines became a haunting parable about the very nature of belief. It revealed that the greatest threat to faith is not doubt, but the certainty of those who would kill to protect a lie. The Abbey's sin was not its fraudulent relic, but its profound fear of the truth, a fear so powerful it turned holy men into murderers and protectors into accomplices. The Codex, with its ghostly, heat-activated script, served as a perfect metaphor for the institution itself, a beautiful, sacred text on the surface, with a dark, damning confession hidden just beneath, waiting for a spark of inquiry to bring it into the light. The story's ultimate lesson was that any foundation built on a lie, no matter how sacred, is not a fortress, but a tomb, destined to crumble under the weight of its own secrets. In the end, Brother Samuel and Brother Daniel received a justice far greater than a legal verdict. They were transformed from forgotten victims of a whispered tragedy into martyrs for the very principles their institution had betrayed. Their refusal to accept a holy lie, their unwavering commitment to an honest faith, became the catalyst for the Abbey's painful but necessary rebirth. Their memory, once erased to preserve a corrupt peace, was now enshrined in stone, a permanent testament to the idea that true holiness is not found in blind obedience, but in the courageous, often dangerous pursuit of what is right. They were the true guardians of the faith, not because they kept its secrets, but because they died, demanding it be worthy of its own sacred name. The silent codex itself, locked away in a climate-controlled evidence locker, became a modern relic of a different kind. It was no longer a map to a grave, but a testament to the enduring power of the written word. It was a silent witness that had waited patiently for 2 decades, a time capsule of guilt left by a man who could neither live with his sin nor fully confess it. The book's journey from a dusty, forgotten shelf to the center of a murder investigation served as a chilling reminder that history is never truly buried. It lies dormant, preserved in the margins and between the lines, waiting for an accidental discovery or a determined seeker to give it voice. It proved that no secret is safe, because paper remembers what men try so desperately to forget. The fate of Abbot Michael became a quiet tragedy within the larger drama. His imprisonment was a legal footnote, but his true sentence was a lifetime of spiritual exile, haunted by the knowledge that he had inherited a legacy of sin and chosen to become its custodian. He was not a monster, but a man broken by a flawed sense of duty, a man who believed the institution was more important than the truths upon which it was supposedly built. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the insidious nature of complicity, demonstrating how good men can become guardians of great evil, not through malice but through the quiet, incremental compromises they make in the name of a greater good, until the silence itself becomes the greatest sin of all. The Abbey's ordeal forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question that extends far beyond its ancient stone walls. How many of our own cherished institutions are built upon their own silent codices? How many corporations, governments, and families are sustained by foundational lies, their stability dependent on the silence of those who know the truth? The story of Our Lady of the Pines is not an isolated anomaly. It is a microcosm of a timeless human struggle. It challenges us to look beyond the pristine facades of the powerful and question the narratives we are told, reminding us that the most sacred-seeming walls can often hide the darkest of secrets, and the guardians of order are sometimes the most devoted protectors of a foundational crime. Years later, a man named Leo works as a rare book archivist in a sprawling university library on the other side of the country. He is quiet, meticulous, and possesses an almost preternatural ability to find what is hidden. He moves among the silent shelves, a custodian of forgotten stories, his past a secret he keeps locked away more securely than any codex. Sometimes, as the late afternoon sun filters through the high windows, he will catch the scent of old paper and melting wax, and for a fleeting moment, he is back in the frigid darkness of the Abbey library. He does not shudder. Instead, he feels a quiet, grim resolve, a reminder of the promise he made to 2 dead men. He is no longer a seeker of sanctuary, but a guardian of a different sort, dedicated to ensuring that no truth, once written, is ever truly lost to the silence. The story of the Silent Codex reminds us that the past is never truly past. It is a living entity that breathes in the margins of our present. The breaking of the Abbey's silence did not end the story. It merely began a new, more honest chapter in its long history, and set a young man on a path he never could have imagined. This journey into the heart of a sacred lie was a crucible that burned away everything he thought he believed in, leaving behind only the unshakable core of his own conscience. And this was just the beginning of something much bigger. If this story has made you think about the secrets hidden in our own world, please consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. We bring you stories that challenge and explore the complex truths that lie just beneath the surface, and your support helps us continue that mission. Ultimately, the Codex revealed a truth far more profound than the location of a hidden grave. It taught that a faith that cannot withstand scrutiny is not faith at all. It is a fragile superstition. Leo, the boy who went to the Abbey seeking God, found instead the devastating and liberating truth of human fallibility. He learned that sanctuary is not a place you can find, but a choice you must make. The choice to confront the darkness, both in the world and in oneself, with unblinking courage. The true codex is the human heart, and its most important confessions are not written in invisible ink, but in the indelible actions we take when faced with an unforgivable silence.